right, here in Luke's Gospel, in chapter 14, I simply want to use this by way of introduction to what I want to talk about this morning. But you'll notice in verse 16, chapter 14, that the Lord uses a parable of a man making a supper for his son. His son was going to get married, and the tradition was that people were invited some time before the time of the wedding. And then when the actual date came, in other words, he got a commitment from these people so he would know how to plan. Then, when the date of the wedding arrived, he would send out his servants and say, okay, everything's ready, it's time for the wedding. And those very people who had made profession, lip service, began to make excuses as to why they couldn't show up. The banquet was ready now, and people had made a promise they would come, but now they're excusing themselves. And you'll notice in verse 18 it says, and they all with one consent began to make excuse. And one of the things you find about mankind is we are quick to excuse ourselves. Do you ever stop to think how much of our life is spent making excuses for ourselves? It started with Adam and Eve. Adam said, the woman you gave me, it's her fault. And so he excused himself by saying it was her fault. She excused herself by saying it was the devil's fault. Poor old devil, he didn't have anybody to blame. He just, and I don't mean poor old devil. I feel no sympathy for him. I'm just trying to teach you a point here. But if he could have found somebody, I'm sure he would. And maybe he blamed God. That's what he did in the book of Job. So everybody is quick, all of us. I mean, we just excuse ourselves, and I'm sure that preachers and police officers have heard more excuses than anybody in the world. And so here, each of these begin to say, excuse me, have me excused. And the very fact that we can say, excuse me, according to Romans 1, shows that we at least know there's some kind of responsibility. Now, when you move down to the latter part of the chapter there in verse 22, the servant came and he showed his Lord the things that he had done and what people said. And you'll notice that the Lord was angry. If you go up to verse 21. So that servant came and showed his Lord these things. Then the master of the house, being angry, sent out his servant. So he was not pleased with these excuses. And then when you go down to verse 24, he said, for I say unto you that none of these men, or those men which were bidden, shall taste of my supper. Now the point I want to get across to you is that we are quick to make excuses. And we need, secondly, is understand that God does not accept them in most cases. Now, I think there are things that are legitimate. We can, in some cases, excuse ourselves and be just before God in doing it. But in most cases, we cannot. And this being Stewardship Month, I want to talk to you today about this matter of stewardship and how unreasonable it is for us to try to excuse ourselves from being a part of it. I think every Christian ought to be involved in stewardship. I don't know of anybody that ought to be exempt. I can't find anybody who's so poor they should be exempt. I mean, there's nobody here as poor as the two greatest givers in the Bible. And I don't know of anybody who's so rich they should be exempt. Do you? So I just can't, as I look at both ends of the spectrum here, I can't find any reason that God might accept as we try to excuse ourselves. For instance, in Genesis chapter 14, there you have a man by the name of Abraham. And Abraham, of course, becomes the friend of God. He's called the friend of God. And God calls this man in chapter 12. But when you get to chapter 14, you see an unusual thing happen. Abraham meets up with a mystery personage in the Bible. And that mystery man is a high priest. And he is such a mystery that the book of Hebrews spends a lot of time talking about him. Melchizedek is mentioned also in the Psalms. He's in Genesis, he's in Psalms, and he's in Hebrews. And God said of Jesus Christ, "Thou art my Son." And then he went on to say that thou art a priest forever. He said of Christ, "Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Now, I know there's certain religions that try to establish a Melchizedek priesthood, but it's nonsense and they're wasting their time. There is only one Melchizedek, and his final type was Jesus Christ. But hear this mystery priest. We don't know much about him. We know he was a king. We read in verse 18 of chapter 14, Genesis, that he was the king of Salem. That is, the old city of Jerusalem. We also know that he was a priest. So, he was a king and a priest. And he offered sacrifices. And we know of Jesus Christ that he was a king and that he is a priest. And he'll be a priest forever, no doubt. And when he met Abraham, he blessed Abraham. So that means that it says, "And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand." This is Melchizedek talking to Abraham. And we read that the less Abraham is blessed of the better. Now listen, this mystery individual here was better than Abraham. And Abraham was the founder of a great nation. And Abraham, of course, was the head of the patriarchs of Isaac and Jacob. And Abraham was called the friend of God. And it was through Abraham that God promised that he would give all the land of Palestine. All of the land over there. Matter of fact, from the Mediterranean all the way to the Euphrates and so on. And as great as Abraham was, this mystery person is greater. Because it says the less is blessed of the greater. And then, in response, Abraham, if you look at the last part of verse 20, Abraham gave tithes of all. Now the word tithe means tenth. And it is symbolic of the whole. In other words, Abraham really, in his heart, didn't say, here's 10% for God and here's my 90%. God's attitude, or Abraham's attitude was that God was the possessor of heaven and earth. That God owned it all. And the tenth here is symbolic of the whole. So Christian, our attitude ought to be that God owns everything. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and he owns the hills. And he can shake those hills when he wants to. And he can shake you off of them. And so Abraham then gave a tithe. Now the interesting thing is, this is the very first time in the Bible the word tithe ever shows up. You go to Genesis 1 and go through all 14 chapters, or 13 chapters, and you won't find the word one time. Here's the first time it comes up. And I don't have any record of God ever commanding Abraham to give the tithe. But he gave it. And my assumption is that Abraham recognized the ownership of God, and he loved God, and he wanted to give to God that portion that represented God's total ownership. And in this case, it was a tithe. And Abraham did it, I think, because he honored God. No command, no instruction. It just says he gave him the tithe. That's all you read about it. Some folks say, well, under the law you were supposed to do that. Well, that was true under the law, but this is 400 and something years before the law was ever given. This is under grace. Now, let me just ask you this. Do you feel that you and I should ask God to excuse us when Abraham is commended for giving the tithe? I mean, God accepted Abraham's offer. Abraham was called the friend of God because he honored God. And should you and I say, okay, that's good for Abraham, but excuse me? Why would we think that we should do less? Please have me excused. I know Abraham was your friend. I know Abraham offered his only son. And I know Abraham, you could depend on him. And I know Abraham gave the tithe without a command. But could you excuse me? The second would be when you come to Leviticus chapter 27. Would you go there, please? Leviticus chapter 27. By this time, Israel has been incorporated into a nation. They are at Mount Sinai. They've received the Ten Commandments. The tabernacle has been built. The priesthood has been established. The requirements for sacrifices and offerings has been recorded. And so here God says something about the tithe. Verse 30, Leviticus 27. Leviticus 27, verse 30. And God said, all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. Now you notice it again. He says it's the Lord's. So when you and I, if this is true of now that God owns everything, when you and I hold back on God, we're not, we're keeping that which belongs to God anyway. And it says, all the tithe of the land, whether it be the seed or the fruit of the tree, notice it says, it is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem his tithe, he shall add thereunto the fifth part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock or whatsoever passeth under the rod, the tenth, that's the word tithe, the tenth shall be holy unto the Lord. He, that is the individual, shall not search whether it be good or bad, neither shall he change it. And if he change it at all, then both it and the change thereof shall be holy. It shall, in other words, it shall not be redeemed. Now these are the commandments. So he's saying here that of the herd, the cattle, of the trees, of the garden, everything on the land, he said, at least a tenth should go to the Lord. And he said if a man tries to keep it, then he has to redeem it. That is, he has to add a fifth to it. And then he says when you go out to the flock to get one of the animals to offer to God and it passes under the rod, he says you're not supposed to check to see what kind of condition it's in. You know how people are. They'll look around, they'll find an old cow with a broken leg and say, we'll take that one down to the tabernacle. Here's one's got pink eye. Let's go down there. She won't bring anything on the auction anyway. Let's give it to the Lord. Now, folks, that's the way people operate. Many times we say we're going to take up a special offering for missions. And what we want to do is make bandages, And years ago, people used to do that. They had women's missionary societies, and they would get together and make up bandages and packages and things of this nature. And folks would bring their old rotten sheets. They didn't need them anymore, so they'd tear these rotten sheets up and make bandages, And they would get food baskets for missionaries. And you would find such things as hominy and spinach and okra and carrot juice and celery juice. And, usually it's things that you had down under the cupboard and the sink has been leaking on them and the labels are gone and the tops are rusted. You can't figure out what's in there anyway. So you just give it to the missionary. That's the idea. I've told this story. I'll tell it again for our visitors today. I pastored in Iowa for a few months, a couple of years. And in that little farm town in Manning, Iowa, there was a fellow. He was about, 250 pounds, all muscle. He worked on a farm. He was slightly retarded. His mother was dead, and he and his father lived there. And one day he showed up at my door. We lived in the parsonage right next door to the church. And I was a student in college and pastoring the church and had 4 children. And we were just kind of, how it is, hand-to-mouth type thing. And so he came in one day and he had a box of meat. And I'm telling you, that box was about the size of the top of this pulpit. And he came in, a giant of a man. He came in with that box and got over and he put it down on the table. And the table legs practically buckled under it, And I was so pleased to get all of this meat. And I said, you shouldn't have done it. That's what you always say, but you really mean, I'm glad you did it. And I said, you shouldn't have done it. And he said, Pastor, it really wasn't nothing. He said, we just butchered a calf, and we had to clean out their freezer. And my dad told me to take all this meat and give it to the hogs. And I said, no, let's give it to the pastor. And so they brought that box of meat that was supposed to give to the hogs and gave it to us, you see. And that's the way many folks think. They think that we'll give God the leftovers. And that's the way a lot of folks tithe, They take care of their eating out and all of their fineries and everything out of their paycheck, and then if they have anything left over when the plate goes by, they'll just kind of check, see how much they got, and they put it in the offering plate. I don't think that's the way God would have us to do it. As a matter of fact, I know it's not the way God would have us to do it. You need to put God at the top of your shopping list. And you need to write your check for the work of God when you get your check rather than after you've paid all your bills and spent. I'll tell you why. Because the devil's going to see to it that you'll never have enough to do the work of God. Well, if I was the devil, that's what you would do. So you need to put God first. In the Bible, it's always the first fruits. It's always the first fruits. It's not the leftovers. So God says that you will not, if you'll notice in our text, He says, you shall not search whether it be good or bad. Neither shall you change it. If you find it was too good, the story of the guy who thought he was putting in $5 and put in a $50 bill, he almost had a heart attack. Now, if God accepted the tithe from Abraham, and he was the friend of God, and God required the tithe of Israel, and they couldn't change it, shall we say, God, you excuse me? Don't expect me to be a part of this. You accepted it from Abraham, you demanded of Israel, but excuse me. I'm under grace, God. Didn't you know that? Excuse me, I'm under grace. Why, if that isn't abuse of grace, I don't know what it is.